Welcome to the Front Row, brought to you by the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. In today's show, Kithmina Hewage, Research Officer, Institute of Policy Studies, is in conversation with Dr.Ganeshan Wignaraja, Chair of Global Economy Program at Lakshman Kadiragamar Institute. Dr. Wignaraja advises both the Sri Lankan government and the private sector to look to Asia and seek new opportunities to take the economy to the next level of development. Sri Lankan export industries need to diversify from traditional markets and connect with growing economies in Asia. He identified 3 factors the private sector should address in building business in East Asian markets: be sensitive to the business culture, understand the ways of East Asian countries do business, and study rules and regulations. Let's now listen to Dr. Ganeshan Wignaraja.
In terms of Sri Lanka's trade strategy over the past 10 or 20 years, comparative to other Asian economies, where would you place us and how would you rate us?
So Sri Lanka is essentially a small open economy, and different governments over the last couple of decades or so have tried to maintain that openness or in some ways change it in some form. And the most recent phase we have is a national government that has come in with an explicit investment and export-led strategy in 2015, and they are emphasizing both attracting foreign investment into mega projects as well as into the manufacturing and service sectors, as well as something new for us, which is free trade agreements. And the current strategy looks at 3 types of free trade agreements: with India, deepening the existing arrangement, China, a new agreement, and Singapore. And essentially, we're trying to do something more complicated to expand our openness as well as market access with a distinct thrust towards Asia.
And why is this thrust effectively needed? Because some might say that our industries are not tailored towards the Asian market because our traditional markets are towards the US and Europe. If in terms of criticism of that sort, how would we respond and how should we respond?
So keeping a population of 20 odd million people fed, clothed and working requires trading. An enhancement of this is needed because for 20 years or so in the last period, we have neglected our outward orientation to some extent. And by that I mean our regional trade strategy. And so we need to ensure we are hooked up with the fastest growing markets that will give us access to global value chains. East Asia is famous for this, and India is increasingly being a magnet of such activity, particularly the relocation of industry from China is going towards India as well as some of the ASEAN countries. And if Sri Lanka wants to benefit from the industrial efforts of China and its relocation through India, we would want to have a trade-led growth strategy emphasizing FTAs.
There's some concern in regards to the Asian miracle, so to speak, about Asia's growth over the last few decades, particularly in terms of as a response to protectionism in the US as well as in some parts of Europe. Do you feel that this Asian miracle is slowing down, or do you feel that Asia will continue with its growth and dynamism?
So East Asia in particular has seen slower trade growth and slower GDP growth the last 3 years compared to historic levels. So the global financial crisis had a huge impact on trade and demand in the region. This was a shock that came from outside the region. But we also have the change in China's industrial and export growth rate, which is slowing dramatically. To give you an illustration, China's rate of growth of exports had slowed from around 18 odd % during the heyday of trade before 2007 to around 4 or 5% export growth rate today. So that gives you an idea of the magnitude in which the trade growth has occurred. However, this is an opportunity for a country like Sri Lanka because we can attract industry from China. We can have increasing exports to China. We can also begin to provide services to China and the rest of East Asia. So the protectionism that we are seeing, particularly in developed countries, the United States in particular with America First, won't affect us so much in that way. But there has been a rise in protectionism more generally, and this is non-tariff measures, phytosanitary standards, TBT, dumping measures. We need to really guard against this by making sure there's proper surveillance in our Department of Commerce of external barriers in external markets, with a lot of talking to exporters. But we need to also be cognizant of the fact that WTO has a dispute settlement mechanism which we can access. I'm not sure whether Sri Lanka has been very active in the dispute settlement mechanism. And on a bilateral basis, we should also take up some of these trade frictions. And it's really the duty of business to report these issues both through the chambers but well as to government, so these issues can be taken up.
Moving to a more private sector orientation, what are some of the main challenges that Sri Lankan manufacturers or firms would face when pivoting to Asian markets?
The first thing that we've got to look at is the fact that Sri Lankan firms are not that familiar with East Asian markets. China, for instance, there are language barrier issues. There are also ignorance of certain types of regulations in China. And it is, a state-dominated economy still. So through our Export Development Board and our other organs of trade, we should go to trade fairs in China. We should attempt to also form partnerships with Chinese companies. There should be courses in Mandarin and other languages from China in our universities and our technical colleges. We should have also exchanges of our students in China. So we really need to first solve the information gap. And the way of doing business in East Asia is very different to here. In East Asia, if they strike a deal, and it is difficult to reach a deal, they mean business. And if as a supplier from Sri Lanka, you don't meet the terms of that deal, you can't say, come back next week, as they often say here, or I'm sorry, sir, or something of that type. You may not get a second contract, or indeed the contract may be cancelled. So the private sector really needs to expend a lot of resources in understanding the culture, the business culture, the rules and regulations of foreign markets, and the ways of doing business in East Asia, particularly China, which is increasingly a major focus, but also Japan and Korea and the rest of East Asia.
One of the most key developments in terms of trade policy for Asia and the ASEAN region in particular is the growth of RCEP. That includes China, India, and several of the ASEAN countries as well. Where does Sri Lanka place in terms of the development of RCEP? Is this something that Sri Lanka should aspire to join at some point? Or would you say that some of the commitments that might come through the agreement are politically infeasible?
So essentially we have taken the bilateral trade route, which means we are doing FTAs with China, with India and with Singapore. RCEP is a regional agreement that involves essentially 16 countries, with ASEAN at the center, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand and India. And it started 3 years ago and probably will conclude in 2018. That's what people expect. It deals with goods, services and investment at the core, but there is an agenda for issues beyond that. The nice thing about RCEP is that you have a market of in excess of 2 billion people, comprising 30% of world GDP in one of the most dynamic regions of the world. Sri Lanka is not a party to these negotiations. The way that Sri Lanka might enter these negotiations is through getting observer status in ASEAN. This is something, ironically, Sri Lanka was offered some decades ago, a membership of ASEAN, but for whatever reason, the government of the day decided not to take it up. Now it's going to be harder because there are many countries that want to become dialogue partners of ASEAN, so we are in a queue. I'm not quite sure where our ranking in the queue is, but if we are smart, our agreement with Singapore, FTA with Singapore, will give us some leverage to enter the ASEAN market and is in fact a very important agreement. And through strong diplomatic efforts, through our foreign ministry in both Singapore as well as in Indonesia, we may want to try to lobby for ASEAN observer status. Most likely that is going to come on the basis of sectoral dialogue partnership, which means they'll be interested in particular sectors of Sri Lanka. My thinking is that we should put our best batsmen forward, which means our best sectors. So that is essentially tea, textiles, and some of the services sectors such as information technology, and we should begin to look at ways in which we might integrate those sectors into an ASEAN framework. And we should also plan a series of track 2 or track 3 dialogues, which is not the official discussion processes, but between think tanks in ASEAN and our think tanks, to start talking about what Sri Lanka's contribution might be or its potential role in linking up with ASEAN and beyond. And we can still suggest that Sri Lanka is a sort of a gateway to the rest of South Asia and indeed the Indian market, and we should leverage that as well. So a sectoral route, emphasizing our best batsmen, tea, textiles and IT, as well as a track 2 dialogue through our think tanks, and also chamber to chamber dialogues are important.
And as a follow-up to that, there's a role also to be played between firms in the ASEAN region, for example, and Sri Lankan firms. How would, from a government policy perspective, how can a government facilitate that process?
So the first, I think, thing that government needs to consider is implementing deep structural reforms in Sri Lanka. We have stopped giving tax holidays for foreign investment, I believe. So that means our business climate has to be amongst the best in the world. The recent World Bank Doing Business Index for Sri Lanka places it 110th out of some 160 something countries. So sadly we're at the bottom end of that spectrum, not at the top end. Singapore is number 2. Most of the ASEAN countries are somewhere in the top 50, top 60 countries. So we need to improve our investment climate. Some steps are being made. Government has now got this Sri Lanka Pay, this digital customs platform. Customs traditionally has been one of the problems. Here it takes too long. There are issues of rent seeking that business worries about. Another issue concerns settlement of disputes. On that, Sri Lankan court system is a major challenge for solving of business disputes, and most people avoid trying to go to court because the process is too protracted and so on. Now, the causes of this and so on are one set of challenges, but we need to really rethink that business dispute resolution. And maybe arbitration is a very simple way. We have to put much more emphasis on independent arbitrators in the private sector trying to solve certain kinds of disputes, so we don't have to go to the court system to solve a dispute, which is costly and time consuming. A third very important area we've got to look at is labor regulations, which we have to go to, to some extent we need a flexible labor market. We should also look towards the trade agreements with East Asia. We have one with China and one with Singapore that we are planning. We should try to do this in a sequenced manner. I believe the agreement with China is a very logical thing, mainly because there's a lot of Chinese interests here with the port and the airport in the south, but other areas. We should attempt to engage more with the Chinese and attempt to strike. And I think politically they'll be very disposed towards Sri Lanka. Then in terms of helping government, I think we should look at the resources we put into our Export Development Board and our investment BOI, and we should try to have some focus towards East Asia in terms of our promotion resources. So for instance, trade fair participation in East Asia could be matched by a matching grant. 50% of it from a firm and 50% from government. The 50% from the firm is very important rather than a total subsidy from government, because it shows the commitment for the firm to want to do market development in a particular area, say China or Korea or Japan. And we should then put a lot more emphasis on understanding the business culture, the language and the education systems of those countries by also sending our students to East Asia much more, taking advantage of scholarships offered by JICA or in the Chinese government or the Korean government. So we get a much better understanding of those countries we're going to trade with. We should try to encourage airlines from those countries to come here. We should try to find Sri Lankan Airlines routes to those countries as we go forward. So I think there's a lot of things we should do, but it has to be part of a very concerted effort to try to link more towards East Asia because that is the world's most dynamic region.
Right. I think the overall key message I guess you're trying to make is that trade policy is not necessarily just limited to free trade agreements or a singular agreement or so. It's about it's a complex network of policy decisions that need to be made to facilitate that sort of trade process and to facilitate trade in that sense as well.
Indeed, trade is part of one instrument of government, and we need to look at from the way in which we approve foreign investment, to the way in which we regulate our domestic business, to the way that we support our small and medium enterprises, in particular through finance and technical support, so that the benefits are spread much more equally. So we need to take a very careful look at our reforms, and then I think we need to build a consensus between government and unions and NGOs, very important, because these are key bodies in our society. We are a democracy, albeit somewhat seemingly chaotic and somewhat seemingly dysfunctional, but we are a democracy, and that's the way in which we are, and we have to do a lot of dialogue with our own stakeholders, and we have to reach out and we have to educate our people and have a proper conversation. We also, further afield, have to build a national consensus across the political parties on the nature of our outward orientation and the long-term strategy. This is not something that, let's say for the sake of argument, in 2020, you'll have another group that might come to power and say, we want to completely change the policy and embrace Iran and North Korea and some other places, and saying that these are the engines of growth, when clearly they're not. So I think we need to somehow build a conversation across the country, across sections of society, that says, okay, we're going to maintain outward orientation, because that, compared to the alternative inward orientation, there is no choice. Second, we have to have a clear set of issues around a set of trade adjustment measures. Safeguards and anti-dumping measures are one part of that, but that can also become protectionist. But we have to have safety nets and retraining for our workers, so that we ensure transition of declining sectors, because there are winners and losers in trade. And third, we have to build a national consensus for these policies, and particularly the thrust towards East Asia. So we're talking about a program spanning at least another decade. And I hope if we do the right things now, we have created the conditions for Sri Lanka to emerge successfully from this tremendous cost of the war that we've had in Sri Lanka, economic and social and political, and build a dynamic economy that can go beyond low middle income status to middle income status and sustain that, so that we can ensure prosperity for all Sri Lankans. That would be my dream.
I think that's the dream of all of us. So thank you very much, Dr. Wignaraja. We greatly benefit from your inputs.
You are watching The Front Row, brought to you by the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. In today's episode, Kithmina Hewage, Research Officer, Institute of Policy Studies, was in conversation with Dr. Ganeshan Wignaraja, Chair of Global Economy Program at Lakshman Kadragamar Institute. The Ceylon Chamber of Commerce invites you to post your comments on the Facebook page of Economy.lk. Thank you for watching The Front Row. Stay tuned for more insightful and informative episodes.